You know what keeps me up at night? The thought that in our hyper-connected world, we're actually teaching our kids to be more disconnected than ever. But I just heard this fascinating story that completely challenges that idea.
What made you think about this particular angle on modern parenting?
Well, it's this incredible situation that unfolded recently. A 14-year-old boy found himself alone on a Chicago train platform at 1:30 a.m. with a dead phone, while his mother was 800 miles away. But instead of ending in disaster, it became this powerful lesson about connection beyond technology.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. How did this mother handle being so far away when her child was in potential danger?
You know what's fascinating? Instead of panicking, she relied on something she'd been teaching her children for over 25 years. This concept she calls the golden light of protection. It's like this invisible shield she created through meditation and prayer.
So you're telling me that in the middle of what most parents would consider their worst nightmare, she turned to a spiritual practice?
Exactly right. And here's where it gets really interesting. When her son was finally picked up safely, he told the parent who rescued him that he wasn't even scared because he knew his mom had put a light of protection around him. Think about that. A teenager in Chicago, one of the most dangerous cities in America, feeling completely secure because of something his mother taught him when he was just 8 years old.
That's remarkable, especially considering how cynical teenagers can be about their parents' beliefs and teachings. What do you think made this particular approach so effective?
Well, I think it comes down to consistency and authenticity. This wasn't just some random thing she told him once. She had been practicing this for over 2 decades. And you know what really strikes me? The way it provided both practical and emotional support. While his phone was dead, our usual lifeline in emergencies, he had this other kind of connection to fall back on.
That makes me think about how we're approaching safety and security with kids in the digital age. We're so focused on GPS tracking and cell phones, but what happens when the technology fails?
Right. And let's look at some statistics here. According to recent studies, about 95% of teens have access to smartphones. But what we're seeing is that this constant connection might actually be increasing anxiety rather than reducing it. This story shows us there might be something more fundamental we need to be teaching our kids.
How do you think this approach might translate to families who aren't particularly spiritual or religious?
That's such an important question. I think the core principle here isn't necessarily about religious belief. It's about creating a sense of resilience and inner strength that works even when external support systems fail. You know, psychologists have found that children who have some form of internal coping mechanism show significantly better outcomes in crisis situations.
The timing of this conversation feels particularly relevant given the rising rates of anxiety and depression we're seeing in young people. Do you think there's a connection?
Oh, absolutely. And the numbers back this up. Recent studies show that teen anxiety has increased by 70% over the past decade. But here's what's fascinating. Research also shows that young people who have strong spiritual or philosophical frameworks, regardless of specific beliefs, tend to show greater resilience in face of stress and uncertainty.
That really challenges our modern approach to protecting kids, doesn't it?
It does, and here's another layer to consider. In our rush to protect kids with external measures, we might actually be undermining their ability to develop internal strength. You know, child development experts have found that overprotection can actually increase anxiety and reduce confidence in young people.
Well, that certainly puts this mother's approach in a different light. Instead of trying to control every situation, she gave her son tools to handle uncertainty.
Exactly. And what's really powerful is how this approach bridges the gap between ancient wisdom and modern challenges. In a world where we're dealing with unprecedented levels of disconnection, despite or maybe because of our technology, this story shows us how traditional practices might offer solutions we hadn't considered.
Do you think there's a way to measure the actual impact of these kinds of practices?
Well, while it's challenging to quantify spiritual protection, we do have some interesting data. Studies on mindfulness and meditation in young people show up to a 60% reduction in behavioral problems and a 50% decrease in anxiety when these practices are consistently implemented. But what makes this story unique is how it combines protection with empowerment.
That's fascinating. It's like creating a safety net that actually encourages independence rather than dependency.
And you know what's really striking about this particular case? The mother had to tell her son straight up that she couldn't help him in that moment. That's such a powerful message. Acknowledging our limitations while still maintaining a connection through something deeper.
How do you think this kind of approach might evolve as our world becomes increasingly digital?
That's where things get really interesting. We're seeing a growing movement of parents and educators trying to find ways to combine technological literacy with emotional and spiritual intelligence. Some schools are even incorporating mindfulness and meditation practices into their safety protocols.
It sounds like we're coming full circle, using ancient practices to solve modern problems.
Exactly. And here's what I think is the most important takeaway. We need to expand our definition of what it means to protect our children. It's not just about physical safety or digital security anymore. It's about giving them internal tools that work regardless of external circumstances.
That's quite a paradigm shift from the helicopter parenting we've seen in recent decades.
You know what? I think we're witnessing a real turning point in how we approach parenting and protection. This story isn't just about one mother's spiritual practice. It's about recognizing that true security comes from building internal strength, not just external safeguards.
So, what's the key message for parents trying to navigate this balance?
I think it's about understanding that protection isn't just something we do to our children, but something we help them develop within themselves. Whether it's through spiritual practices, mindfulness, or other forms of internal development, we need to give our kids tools that work even when we can't be there or when technology fails them.
That's really powerful and quite different from how many of us were raised.
And that's exactly why this conversation matters so much right now. As we face increasingly complex challenges in raising the next generation, maybe the answer isn't more sophisticated technology or stricter controls. Maybe it's helping our children develop that inner light of protection that no one can take away from them.